Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to the 71st webinar of the Transportation Asset Management Series. Thank you for being here today. For those who do not know me, I'm Christos Xenofondos from the Rhode Island Department of Transportation. I'm here today in my capacity as the chair of AASHTO's Committee on Performance-Based Management, which is the parent committee of the Asset Management Subcommittee. This worthwhile webinar series is being sponsored by AASHTO and Federal Highway, and it is through the continuous support of both organizations that we are able to provide all of our state members and practitioners with the tools and resources to continue advancing asset management practices. There have been webinars in this series every 2 months going back to 2012 on a variety of topics in asset management. Today's webinar will feature Martin Gorton from WSP, Trisha Stefanski from Minnesota DOT, William Robert for Spyport Partners, and Chris Whipple from Utah DOT, will be sharing information about the recently enhanced Digital AASHTO TAM Guide Chapters 2 and 5 and best practices related to these topics. For more information on this webinar series, visit tam-portal.com. That's tam-portal.com. From there, click Events in the main menu to register for any webinar. You'll also find archives of previous webinars and links to video and slides from today's webinar will be posted on the site. The portal is the home of AASHTO's Subcommittee on Asset Management. For more information on the subcommittee, also visit the portal and click on the Subcommittee on Asset Management under the Community menu. The Asset Management Subcommittee is led by Mike Johnson of Caltrans, whom I would like to thank for his leadership and for continuing to promote the activities and work of the subcommittee. If you are not actively involved with the subcommittee, I would encourage you to reach out to either Mike or myself and to let us know, and we'll make sure that you receive the invites to the meetings and we engage you. One important element of the work of the subcommittee is the development of an annual asset management state of the practice survey. The survey is open now through the end of October, and we ask for all of your help in responding to the survey. Look for the link to the survey in the chat. If you have any questions or suggestions on future webinar topics, or have questions for the presenters during today's webinar, please submit your comments or questions using the webinar's chat feature. We will answer questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Lastly, some audio logistics for the webinars. Audience members will be invited to unmute and share their views during the group discussion session at the end of the webinar. Until then, we hope you'll be careful to keep your audio connection muted. If you haven't already, please be sure to mute your audio so that our presenters are not interrupted. Thank you for doing that. We will now have a recorded message from Tasha Clemons of Federal Highway.
Want me at TRB, they want me at the AASHTO conferences because that's where
Good afternoon or good morning to everyone joining us today. I'm Tasha Clemens, and I represent the Transportation Asset Performance Team in the Office of Infrastructure of Federal Highway Administration. Federal Highways, in cooperation with the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management, is very pleased to sponsor this webinar series. We feel it's a great way to bring people together around a series of important topics and to connect with the asset management community. The webinar today is focused on the TAM Guide, Chapter 2, with a focus on TAM strategies and planning, and Chapter 5, with a focus on resource allocation. Chapter 2 covers integrating TAM strategies and plans with the agency's overall vision and strategy. And Chapter 5 covers the resource allocation process, which is a key component of transportation asset management. So today, our speakers will be sharing experiences regarding these aspects of the guide. I'm also very excited to say that we have reached with this webinar our 71st webinar in our series. And FHWA's Transportation Asset Performance Team is committed to increasing knowledge and capabilities at transportation agencies across the U.S. I encourage you to visit us online for more information and to gain access to available resources. And for your availability, the address is shown on the screen. And finally, I just want to say thank you for your participation. You will enjoy today's presentations. Now I would like to turn it over to Hyana Park of Spy Pond Partners to give an overview of today's webinar, to review today's agenda, and to introduce our speakers. Hyana?
All right. Thanks, Tasha, for her message. I'm Hyana Park with Spy Pond Partners. As Christos mentioned previously, the purpose of the webinar series is to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the asset management community. I did want to just remind people what the value of the taking the survey is, because this year, all of the webinars we've conducted this year have been organized based on the results of the survey that was conducted at the end of last year. So like the survey that Christos just mentioned and the link provided in the chat, that survey was coordinated with the Digital TAM Guide update effort, and we asked people about where they had knowledge, where they had less knowledge, and kind of, in a way, we looked at the gap between the areas of importance with the areas of resources, and the kind of the order that we're taking on the webinar topics have been determined by the survey input. And then the survey is designed around the TAM Guide organization, the asset management framework, and so, which is tied to the chapters of the TAM Guide, and the enhanced digital guide is being used to kind of set the context and share some practices. All right, so so what you're going to get from the webinar today is learn more about the chapters 2, strategy and planning, and chapter 5, resource allocation of the digital TAM guide. I hope you all are going to have a chance to go and look at it, because in the last couple of months, a newer version of it was released. And then we're also going to highlight implementation of the MnDOT Strategic Action Plan and the lessons learned from that experience, and then also feature best practices from Utah DOT regarding their asset valuation experience. For the agenda today, we started off by hearing from Christos Xenofontos and Tasha Clemens. I'll introduce our speakers before each presentation, but in brief, they are Martin Gordon with WSP, who will give an overview of the TAM Guide Chapter 2, strategy and planning enhancements. Trisha Stefanski from Minnesota DOT presenting on their TAM strategy and planning activities. Bill Robert from Spy Pond Partners providing an overview of the TAM Guide Chapter 5, and Chris Whipple from Utah DOT, who will give an example of resource allocation via their asset valuation exercise at their agency. Time permitting, we'll have an open group discussion at the end. And just another reminder, please submit your comments or questions using the Zoom chat feature at any time during the webinar. We'll make sure to cover them at the end of the webinar. And as mentioned before, we will make the slides and video available after today's webinar at tam-portal.com. So with that, I am going to, let's move on to our first presentation. And Marty Gordon is here. I can see him on the webinar, but we weren't, he flew today and we weren't sure if he was going to make it. So he pre-recorded his presentation, but will be available to answer questions at the end. So Marty is a leader in WSP's asset management team. He's a professional engineer and a chartered professional accountant and an honorary research associate at the University of New Brunswick, where he lives. He was a contributing author to both the ISO 55000 standard and the AASHTO TAM guide, and has a passion for helping clients make better, sustainable infrastructure decisions for service delivery. He has worked in the US, Canada, New Zealand, Norway, and Saudi Arabia. Let's view Marty's presentation.
Thanks, Jenna. So welcome everybody. My name is Marty Gordon and I'll be talking over the next 15 minutes or so about Chapter 2. And while I'll be giving an overview of Chapter 2 and the new features that are included in the digital guide, I think it's important for setting some context for the other speakers that follow about what is the breadth of the content that exists within this chapter. I expect many of you have read the chapter already, but I think it's useful also just to call back in the moment for everyone as to some of the concepts that are in this section and how that might relate to what we're going to hear later. I was involved with the early part of the physical guide and have been part of the review team for the digital version. I promise this is the last WSP blatant marketing slide, but the only reason I included it was I think it's important. I originate from an Norwegian company that was acquired by WSP 6 or 7 years ago. And what surprises me still is that there are asset management teams in almost every country where we operate and lots of places where we don't. And the stories that you hear from asset managers across the landscape is often there's local contexts that make it unique to that location, but more commonly it is shared experience, shared challenges. And I think it's important that we have conversations like this one in a webinar that share those experiences. And I think you'll find within the digital guide, we purposefully sought to bring some international content that tells some of those stories from other jurisdictions. It's important for us to learn from our peers that are kind of in the same slowly boiling water with the other frogs about what it is that we need to do next in order to improve our asset management program. But sometimes it's useful to see somebody outside that boundary because their example, their context, their experience might give insights that isn't obvious to those of us that are close by. So what is Chapter 2 meant to be focused on? And I think I think the quick summary is it focuses on how it is that we link what it is that we're trying to achieve as an organization, whether that's state level government or the DOT itself, to the decisions that we make in terms of how we're spending capital dollars, maintenance dollars, or operational decisions to be sure that we're actually contributing incrementally to achieving the overall goals of the organization. It's not just about condition. It's obviously about us achieving the outcomes that leadership within state aspires us to do and achieve. And so that links, I think, in truth to all of the sections within the chapter. all 6 sections are listed here. I'm not going to read this. You can read it for yourself. You'll note that 2.5 and 2.6 are new. If you haven't checked those out, I would encourage you to do so. That's entirely new content with the digital guide. And let's just, you're only going to have to listen to me for another 6 slides. I have one for each of these where we'll just talk a little bit about the content that's existing, that's in the existing guide, as well as some of the new content that you'll see as part of the digital guide that is available now. So the first section, it links to what I was just saying in terms of that line of sight to organizational mission, vision, strategic priorities. It's important for that to be to have that linkage. Otherwise, what we see within client organizations is that often decisions are being made that may actually diverge away from, so you're spending capital or maintenance dollars in a way that is actually taking you away from achieving those objectives for good reasons, potentially in isolation, but not good reasons taken holistically as where that line of sight or that North Star is meant to be all of us pulling towards that direction. This first section has a number of new video resources that you can see listed there. Some of these videos were recorded in the past, but we thought they most appropriately linked to the content that's within the guide here. The figure that you can see there is from the original guide, and it underlines the importance of us having to do that recheck, because it's not just that political priorities change within a client organization, but externalities change, and we need to adjust the system to be sure that it's aligned. The asset management system continues to be aligned to where we're aiming to go as a state and as a DOT. The next section talks about, there's a lot of language in there about integrating different concepts, different management systems. So there's new video resources that you can see there. And there's a whole new section on resilience. You know, when I first started working in the United States, I met a lot of clients that found that it was confusing, the difference between what is performance management. I'm hearing a lot about this asset management. There's risk management. There's resilience. I'm getting overwhelmed with a number of management practices, management systems that I should be focusing on, and how then this section speaks to these should be integrated and where the overlap might be. Resilience is important, and certainly we've seen that with the hurricanes in the last few weeks. And while the section actually speaks a lot to climate or environmental resilience, we see a lot of client organizations also trying to be resilient to other things. And so being resilient means that maybe you're resilient to technological change, which I think is coming with autonomous vehicles or other technologies that are changing how it is that we move people and things. Society's changing as well. There's demographic change that I think are impacting many of our states. And so it's important for, I guess, us to have a systematic way in order to evaluate what are we trying to be resilient for, and how do we integrate that in terms of a risk approach to be integrating those considerations in our TAM planning. The next section has a couple video resources, but really didn't change a whole lot in terms of the text that's there. It talks a little bit about or focuses on the kind of the gap assessment improvement plan, you know, where you self-assess and decide where am I going to improve my asset management program this year, next year, in the future. I would say this is really important. Certainly you should be doing this all along. And I would call a linkage to maybe, I think it's in chapter 3, where we speak a little bit about change management as well. I have found in my own practice that while an improvement plan developed by the asset management folk seems really great and is an improvement, there's often people within the client organization that don't see those changes as an improvement, and resistance emerges. And so as you're developing and assessing where you need to prioritize your next step to raise your game, I think it's important for you to be thinking about those other concepts in that other chapter and prepare for those change challenges that might occur as you're trying to change how people do their job. even though we all agree is for the better. The last thing I'll say about this before moving on is also, you know, the WSP or spy pond folk can come in and tell you, well, here's the series of steps you should go forward with in terms of your improvement plan, and here's the ones you should do first: A, B, C, and D. If C and D, though, is there's a couple champions internally that really love and would love to see C and D go forward. We found that there's better success rather than force A and B. Yeah, maybe they're prerequisites and we have to do a little bit of A and B, but let's focus on C and D. It helps with that change management challenge if you have champions internally that want to hook up to that wagon and pull it along. Lots of new Visio resources in section 2.4, and that's talking, a lot of that existing content is talking about what is a basic TAMP, and if you want to go a little bit farther, there's some language in there that talks a little bit about that as well. I would say that most clients, they are actually enhancing pieces of the basics. So don't feel as though you need to reinvent completely the plan. I would say what is most successful is, how are we going to make a better decision this year than we made last year? And where could we improve the basic TAMP if that's what you have in hand? And you're improving maybe how you're assessing condition, how you're doing life cycle planning. You're improving aspects of that. So your plan's got little enhancements, and over time you'll have a much more robust process and a better plan. And you know, you should be patting yourself on the back by having a better plan this year than you had last year. This and the next section are the last two. They're both new. And you'll see that, you know, I think most client organizations focus a lot on their pavements and bridges for good reason. That those things are worth a large portion of the asset portfolio value, and you should probably spend most of your management effort on those. But there are a lot of other ancillary assets that exist within the road corridor, and many of those actually strongly impact some of the service outcomes that are important to users of the road network: lighting and other safety contributory assets. And so many client organizations requested and have an interest in, well, maybe I should be collecting some data on some other assets. And we have to be thoughtful about that. It's not cheap to collect and maintain data. And so, you know, getting back to what I was just saying in terms of making better decisions, what is the cost benefit that we might gain by putting in more time, treasure, and talent and collecting more information about these assets? Am I going to get incrementally actually a much better decision by doing so? And so you have to be thoughtful. And actually there's a number of references that this chapter section relied heavily upon. So there's, if you go have a look at some of the references, you'll find lots of resources in this regard. This was really a sampling to get your attention, to make you consider, and then maybe choose to go investigate more. You can see reliability-centered maintenance. RCM is certainly more commonly done in the private sector, oil and gas, utilities, those sorts of folk, where they're much more systematic. You know, we get into this habit as engineers to, we got to assess condition, and it's true for pavements and bridges because it helps us predict when we should intervene and how things are traveling. But obviously you can just replace something on an interval if you know it's going to fail consistently, and maybe you replace it a year or two before you know it's going to fail because you can't let it to fail, or you just let her fail and then replace it. Let's be thoughtful and be specific about those tactics for those asset types, and be transparent about that, because it kind of helps focus the mind and be efficient and effective as an organization. The last section speaks about incorporating equity within TAM. Important topic that I think is lots of dialogue about that over the last few years. And so there's two sections and two new resources there, a video resource as well as a practice example, which I think is a good one. I think everybody has to figure out how this best fits within their TAM, and so we wanted to certainly include this content to give people a sampling of where they can go and find out more as well. At the end of every chapter, there's a knowledge check, and this chapter is no different within the digital guide, that you can play a little game and see how your score goes. And as I said, the references there are not meant to be a bibliography that you never read in a typical book. This guide allows you to find really useful resources and go search them out. And so see this as your reference or your go-to location to expand that horizon to other jurisdictions around the world or across the United States as to where you might find more information. Then there's only so much we can put in a guide, but there's lots more information out there available. So I hope that gives a nice overview for all of you, and I hope that sets some context for the rest of our speakers. I welcome any questions at the end, but I think we're going to move on to the next speaker. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing the next speaker. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Marty, for your presentation. Now we have a recorded presentation from Trisha Stefanski, who I think is in a remote area of Minnesota for some meetings. Trisha manages the Asset Management Program Office with the Planning Division at Minnesota DOT. Her focus is on asset management, strategic planning, enterprise tool development, performance, data quality, and analytics, and interoperability. Nationally, she's a member of the TRB AJE 30 Transportation Asset Management Committee and the AKT 70 Maintenance Management System Committee, and chair of the AASHTO Joint Technical Subcommittee on Data Standardization and co-chair of the Building Smart Roads and Bridges Industry Committee. Let's view Trisha's presentation.
Well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm from the Minnesota Department of Transportation again, and I am here to talk about our Transportation Asset Management Strategic Action Plan. So how did we get started? What did we do? It was almost 10 years ago, if you can believe that, in 2015, we're gonna have to have a party or something, that our Asset Management Program Office was formed. And that was essential for us to really dedicate champions and central staff to the efforts of asset management. And then in 2016, I learned the term go live because we set up our enterprise asset management system for signals and lighting. Now, we already had a great system for pavement, system for bridge. So this was maybe different than some other states in which we focused on ancillary assets, damage restitution, and maintenance. And then in 2019, and we kept building that enterprise asset management system throughout the years, but in 2019, we said, you know, we have this great system, we have dedicated staff. What do you need? What do the districts need? What do the expert asset areas need? Where are the gaps? And so we had this gap workshop, which I think ABTEC was involved in back then. And we looked at some of these gaps, long-range planning. How do we bring assets into our TAM? We already had several assets, but we wanted to look at more assets. What were the barriers when it came to preventive maintenance? Resource concerns, always resource concerns, right, across the DOTs. And then who's got responsibilities? We found that there were a lot of orphan assets that didn't have a permanent group of people that were responsible. And then the use of the data, you know, continuously difficult to keep all of our data sets and all of our data up to date. And then, as I like to say, for some reason in Minnesota, the legislature loves to get involved in asset management, performance measures, corridor planning. So 2020, the commissioner must inventory bridge, pavement, geotech, pedestrian, bicycle, and transit asset classes. So there it was, you know, clear as mud, right in state statute that we must do this work. And then in 2021, we embarked in our asset management strategic implementation plan. So we did not do that right away. And I think that's a key message here is that you can really write a strategic plan at any time, not the TAMP. We're not talking about the TAMP. We did do a TAMP work group in here, but we're really talking about organizationally how you can improve asset management. So my second slide here, my third slide, is really to say right away, there was so much value in this strategic planning process. Although we've continued to get resources, get help, do things across the agency, I really want to reinforce that the process itself brought so much value. We gained trust, we had targeted improvement areas, we established transparency within our program, of course, that wonderful state statute that we met. We looked at in maturity, which I'll talk about at the end, the MODA, all about MODA, trying to get to MODA. We had cross-agency stakeholder collaboration, and then we have since gone from 7 or 9 people in our office to 22 people with dedicated asset management district specialists. So the asset management strategic plan, just like any other plan, we have a mission, we have objectives, we have goals. This is very important when you're embarking on, again, any strategic plan. So I'm just going to read this to you. At MnDOT, transportation assets are managed effectively based on risk and return on investment using the best available information and tools. Now, if you're looking at creating a strategic plan, just use that. Start out with that, say, what do you think? You can wordsmith it, do whatever you'd like, but I think it really set the stage where we're looking at risk, we're looking at ROI, and everybody loves ROI, and using information and tools. So we said, let's use data effectively, let's improve trade-off evaluation, let's get to MODA, and let's integrate asset management into MnDOT's culture. I'm not going to read you those strategic objectives, but basically that set the tone for the asset management plan. I want to thank ABTEC and SpyPond Partners for leading us in this MnDOT AM SIP, as we call it. So what were the pillars of excellence that we chose? High 5 categories. Communication, that's essential. You have to choose communication. Even if you don't write a strategic plan, please, please, please write a communication plan, because asset management is a lot to do with what is it you're doing? How are you doing that? How can we help? So communication is key. And then geotechnical assets, that darn state statute, the asset matrix, which I was a chair of, and really dug into that work and can tell you more about that. Pavement preservation, and then how can we improve our TAMP? In Minnesota, we started out in 2014. Now we're embarking on a 2026 plan. And sometimes they rely on me to really remember what happened in 2014. I'm like, oh no. So let's cover these topics a little bit. TAM communication, again, this was a really great group, and there's a lot of great information that you'll find out there that we've shared externally with folks. So the challenge. So if you can believe it, and I think you all do because you know asset management, it engages well over half of our department's employees at some level. And our stakeholders range from design, construction, to maintenance, to traffic, and they need all different varying levels of information. So we said, let's look at the plan. Let's look at how we can create this communication plan to say, how does TAM benefit MnDOT? How do I fit into the picture in my role if I'm sitting in design or construction? What are those messages for all the stakeholders? And how do we share all that information? So that was kind of the key pieces of our communication group. And so what did we do? Really created this wonderful portal that's, again, out there for you. Do a search on MnDOT TAM portal. Today is the webinar of portals. There's lots of good information. We have a library of information with presentations, with one-pagers, lots of stuff. If you haven't seen it, please go look for me. Our communication plan right in here. And really what it took was getting all those materials ready and then presenting. And you can see very simple 3 stages. Again, Dave Solzrud did a ton of work here. So did the folks within this group. Thank you. And then I kind of took it on the tail end. We talked to executive leadership, senior leadership. They just couldn't say no to us, office directors. But then we said, send that message out to your folks. Tell them about asset management. What does it mean in their role? What can we do as an agency? We support this. And so I wrote, the aha moment. Now I understand why asset management is important and what I can do to help. And then you can say that, have you heard the Vikings are 5-0 this year? They're going to be good. Everybody watch the purple. So that was just a real short version of our communication plan. And you can find more again online. So the next group, geotechnical assets. I really think this was pushed by state statute and saying we want to legislatively meet state statute, but I also know there's a lot of risk out there. And we at MnDOT are worried more about the bubble, the risk that we're basically going to have older earth retaining structures, maybe some subgrade information that we don't have tracked, and then we might see a bubble of capital improvement that's needed. So this team, the plan for this team was determine what are the geotechnical assets? How do we capture the data now into the future? And then what are the roles and responsibilities here that maybe weren't, determined before? And how do we share this information? And this group actually worked closely with the matrix group that I was in to kind of come up with some of these solutions. So you'll see here kind of a myriad of things. I love, I'm an engineer, love spreadsheets, love matrices, but also here's a 1 to 6, very easy approach to this. So determine the categories. So you can see some of the categories up on the left side that they determine for the geotechnical assets. And then we looked at how are we maintaining this data? How are we, basically putting maintenance to the asset class? Like, are we going to do condition-based assessments? Are we going to do cyclical-based? When are we doing inspections? How are we doing inspections? As well as then what is the timing of that cyclical-based inspection? So kind of a lot of things were determined here right up front, maybe within that work group, and then established, in a program like a couple years after. We built a GIS tool. And GIS tools are really easy now to build. ArcGIS Online tool in which we crowdsourced the information and also went back to plan sets, which wasn't very fun to go into ProjectWise and find data, but that was essential to really get number 4, that inventory put together. And then we took our enterprise asset management system and we developed, you can see that more robust maintenance management enterprise system. And then finally, I think as we were developing TAMs, we said we're going to generate this as-built criteria. We're going to have the specification that's already out there, and we're going to say you can see that tab for geotechnical. So again, please go look if you haven't seen our as-built website. Please go look up at MnDOT GPS or GIS spec, and you'll find that. So the next group was, of course, by far my favorite because I was the chair of this group, but boy, was it a lot of work. It was a really, really, really dedicated work group with homework, and also Michael Kremen. I want to do a shout out for how much he helped me with this. So this is really, what are we doing? What asset classes do we have out there? How are we managing those assets? Where do they fall in a tier system, which has been really helpful for us? And then how are we going to collect this data over time and keep it up to date with economies of scale? And this is what the results were of that. This was 12 weeks of really getting into the spreadsheet, talking to all the work groups, saying, how are we going to manage? What are those priorities as an agency? What are we doing now? And what are desired states for each asset class? So 78 asset classes were identified. You can see I just kind of did a snippet of bike and ped and some geotechnical. There's the tier that we determined. There's that asset management approach, which I've done. You can ask me all kinds of questions on that, and I could get into that more, but for sake of time, just going to move past that. But we said we're going to add assets, and we're very specific in this work group to say, when are we going to get these assets online? How much is it going to cost? And how are we going to keep that asset data up to date? We did an ROI on side culverts. We determined LiDAR data is really the way to go right now versus getting those as-built field collection data. So you can see some of this. And the last thing I want to point out with this slide is all the move to digital delivery and building information modeling. And so thank goodness, we're so happy that we're the recipient of the NICE Connect Advanced Digital Construction Management System grant. And we're really looking to move to interoperability across our systems as well as digital delivery. So I've been involved in quite a bit of that. But this is some outcomes of the matrix group that will just continue as we move through time. And then the last group was pavement preservation. So I think this is almost a group that could happen at any DOT, is that we really want to continue. And actually it's not just pavement, it was preservation, preventive maintenance and preservation throughout the agency. So not just pavement, but bridge and other items too, but looking at our other assets, setting performance measures and targets, formalizing PM planning, creating a web portal. As you all know, preventive maintenance is really important, but a lot of times we don't keep that set aside. We use it for other important things and capital on the capital side of the house. We really want to focus on preventive maintenance. So this was a way to do that. So what are some outcomes here? You can see the performance measures. We just got done meeting with all the districts to talk about pavement performance measures. These are the measures we came up with. We're really continuing to refine these measures and see where we are for targets, where we need to be as an agency. The preservation website was stood up, and so you can search for that if that's something you're interested in, and then dashboards so the districts can see kind of where are we, where should we be statewide, district-wide, and again, using just an ArcGIS online. And then this is probably our biggest to-do list that we're still working on, PM, solidifying lighting, signals, overhead sign structures. We have measures, we haven't really solidified those, getting that reporting annualized. And then looking at, how are we supporting district planning efforts and including STIP guidance and integrating maintenance and capital, because we all know as our capital funds, continue to kind of decrease, that really impacts our maintenance and the kind of maintenance work that we need to do as an agency. And lastly, we have one more. Yeah, we don't want to forget about the TAMP. I don't think anyone would like that. Our Transportation Asset Management Plan, again, started in 2014, said, what is this even about? And then continued to improve our TAMP, added a bunch of asset classes to it. I think we just barely beat Caltran by the most number of assets in our TAMP. I know other states are doing a ton of work in ancillary asset management, but they just may not include these in their TAMP. So what were we going to do here? What are we doing? How do we add additional assets? What is it based on? Kind of based on tiers and other criteria. What are the format changes where we can really make this push button, make it easy for people to read? We want to promote TAMP implementation. And then we want to align with our 20-year MNSHIP plan. So those were kind of some of the important details. And so we came up with that asset addition criteria, tier 1 or tier 2 assets. Do we have enough data readiness? And then are our key experts willing, to be in meetings and do this? So now I'm excited to announce another asset joined our TAMP. Ground mounted sign structures will be in there in 2026. And we are hiring a consultant to help us with our 2026 TAMP. And here are some of the enhancements: risk and resilience strategy, mitigation scoring process, asset valuation, life cycle analysis for all assets, equity and transportation, which is so important, and then really, again, digging in to that implementation of TAMP. So this is my last slide. I just want to say that this process really was eye-opening for me. Again, I would say the actual process itself of bringing people in and talking about this went such a long way. Identify those gap areas and champions. You can do it really quite simply if you just look at communication or look at, I said, preventive maintenance on the TAMP, include those decision makers in these work groups, and then have dedicated commitment. So as example, the matrix, I said, I'm really going to do this. It's going to take a lot of my time, but we need it. And then not just a strategic plan, but an action plan. I would just exclamation mark that. And then request funding, ask for what you need. Say, we need this much funding to complete this work and resource needs. And then we all want to get to the top of that pyramid. So we're really looking for, now we have individual asset data resources. We have our TAMP district maintenance, level of service asset performance targets. Really next step for MnDOT is MODA. So looking at that in the next couple of years. Thank you so much for having me today.
All right. Thank you, Trisha, for her presentation. So our next speaker is Bill Robert. He's a partner at SpyPond Partners with more than 30 years of experience in transportation, in the transportation industry. At SpyPond, he focuses on implementing asset and performance management systems and approaches to strengthen performance-based programming and budgeting. His work includes asset management for bridges, pavements, traffic and safety assets, transit and rail. He has served as principal investigator for many NCHRP projects, including a current one to implement the asset valuation guide, and many TCRP projects as well related to asset management and state of good repair. And he's also doing many asset management related work for agencies, including PennDOT, Caltrans, Michigan DOT, and Connecticut DOT. Bill.
Thanks, Yana. So I'm going to talk about the updates to Chapter 5 of the Transportation Asset Management Guide. This chapter focuses on resource allocation. So first, just where does this fit into the overall asset management guide? You
Hey,
can
Bill,
see,
I just wanted to point out that you need to switch your swap displays. Yes, there you go.
okay, thanks. So this slide just shows the overall framework in the asset management guide. And you can see resource allocation links closely to TAM strategy and planning, which Marty talked about. It's covered in chapter 2, and also monitoring and adjustment. And in this chapter 5, we didn't change the overall resource allocation process, but I just wanted to talk about that for a sec. Because the chapter 5 is structured around this concept of a generic resource allocation process that can be tailored in a lot of ways to support asset management. And this is one of the figures in chapter 5 that depicts the overall process. Here you can see at the top of the figure, resource allocation starts with establishing goals and objectives and determining basic constraints like funding constraints or constraints on resources. And then in some manner, either formally or informally, it's necessary to establish some sort of targets. And from there, the actual sausage making occurs, that you make some sort of initial allocation of resources, prioritize investments within that allocation, and then look and see what that does to performance. And this can be a very structured process supported by models, or it could be more informal. But as you go through this process, it may be necessary to go through it multiple times. And as you go through it, it may be necessary to revise the targets. So you see feedback arrows to quantifying targets. And then at the end of the process, you get a final allocation or investment plan. That's the generic process. And the idea of the chapter is that this process can be applied with using a lot of different tools and approaches, and also can be applied to a lot of different applications. I mean, obviously, the big one is developing a capital plan, but this generic process could also be applied to things like allocating equipment and people to performing maintenance work or other kinds of applications. So that's really the center of chapter 5, is this allocation process. And then we describe, well, like, how does this relate to asset management? So this slide shows on the left panel the overall structure of chapter 5. It's organized into 5 subsections. So the first is this description of this overall process. The second is a discussion of cross-asset resource allocation methods. And that talks about how you can look at cross-resource allocation from more of a top-down approach, where you sort of divvy up your budget and then allocate from there and set targets at a high level, or from more of a bottom-up approach where you prioritize projects across different assets and objectives. And then section 5.3 gets into financial planning and developing a TAM financial plan. Section 5.4 touches on a whole other set of topics related to work planning and delivery. And then section 5 is a new section on asset valuation. So to recap what's changed in chapter 5, then in the first part of the chapter, on resource allocation and prioritization, there is a revised discussion of the linkages to risk. And this really points back to chapter 2 that Marty already described. So we just trying to integrate the 2 chapters. And then a lot of the focus on chapter 5 is specifically on asset valuation. So this is a new section within chapter 5. It describes how to value assets to support asset management. And this new section relies very heavily on a separate document that we developed through different research effort. So there's an asset valuation guide, NCHRP web-only document 335, developed through a different NCHRP project 2306. And so we're summarizing the results of that research in a couple of pages in this document. And there's various other updates to the chapter. It's definitely worth the read if you haven't read it or if you haven't looked at it in a while. We do have a new checklist in the chapter, some videos, and also new references to discuss or at least link to recent research in this area. So on asset valuation, I'll talk a little bit about how that bit is structured and what some of the key takeaways are there. So we have an overall definition of asset value, and then in this subsection, we've got two main sections. One is a framework for asset valuation, and then the second subsection is on how asset valuation can be used to support TAM decisions. So on the framework, again, borrowing heavily from NCHRP Web-Only Document 335, we talk about three different perspectives on what value represents. And we also talk in this section about the motivation for using asset valuation in TAM. And the perspectives on value really help answer different questions and help address different motivations. So usually in asset management plans, we have a cost perspective. We view value as being related to the cost of constructing and maintaining an asset. So how much does it cost the agency to have this asset in the inventory? So that's one perspective on value. That's very useful for asset management, and it's useful for answering a number of questions and supporting a number of applications. But there's also a couple other perspectives that are important. Second perspective is the market perspective. And this perspective, well, basically the question this is trying to answer is how much can we get for this asset, or what can we sell this asset for? And this is a very useful perspective in cases where an asset has a market. So, roads and bridges, maybe not so much. But for something like a vehicle, you can look up what the resale value of a vehicle is and use that to establish the asset's value. So this is a very powerful perspective in cases where there is a market for the asset. And the third perspective is the economic perspective. And so this perspective centers more on the users of the asset, the road users or the transit passenger, what have you, and what value they obtain from using the asset. So this is a very powerful perspective, very useful for answering questions like, well, what's this asset worth to society? Or if this bridge no longer existed, would it be worth it to rebuild it? So, but at the same time, this can be a hard one to address. So it requires different techniques and different kind of analysis to try to address. So in the chapter, and also in the research that we describe in the chapter, the asset valuation approach incorporates all three of these perspectives and provides different steps or different versions of the steps depending on which perspective one takes on value. As far as why do any of this, the overall motivation, we have a brief discussion of some of the key motivations for valuing assets. One that's important is just communicating. You can say, okay, I have this many square feet of bridges and this many road miles of pavement, but that's hard to get your head around. So asset value provides a common set of units, dollars, that you can use to communicate kind of the state, the size of the inventory. Also, tracking asset value, calculating it is consistent with fiscal responsibility. So that's important. Depending on how you're calculating asset value, the level of detail, it can also be used to test different investment strategies and summarize what a given investment strategy will buy you in terms of the value of the inventory. And again, depending on exactly how it's calculated and what perspective you take on, it can be used to help support investment prioritization. So also in this section, we've got an asset value valuation checklist. And what this checklist does is essentially distills the 6 steps in asset value into a checklist form. So if you crack open the asset valuation guide, you'll see that there's basically a chapter on each of these steps. Here for the TAM guide, we have a checklist and we just give a really brief summary of each of these. So the basic steps in conducting an asset valuation analysis is first, figure out the scope of the analysis. What assets are we looking at? What's the right level of detail for characterizing those assets? And what questions are we trying to answer with asset value? Once you've performed that step, and that step's really key, then you can calculate the initial value of the asset. So the value at the start of the analysis, and how you do that and what that means varies depending on the specific perspective. And so then the next step is to think about treatment effects. Depending on what you're trying to do, you may need to explicitly account for treatments that have been performed to an asset over time. For instance, if you're looking at the age of an asset and you have treatments that reset or adjust the age, well, this becomes very important. But in other applications, it may not be so important. If you're basing the value on the condition of the asset and you can observe the condition, you may not need to go back and look at treatment effects. So it's important to think through this step, but it may or may not lead to a lot of work. Then the next step is to calculate depreciation. That's very important. Depreciation is the consumption of an asset's value, so over time. So it's important to have a depreciated asset value if you want to answer questions like, what's the cost to maintain value? You have to be able to depreciate it to see what that cost is. Once you've done all this, there's a lot of technical stuff behind these steps. Then the next step is to actually calculate value. We also have a few supporting measures related to asset value described in the research. So that's an important step, obviously. And then finally, communicate and apply the results. In section 552 of the guide, we talk about what are some of the key questions that doing all this can help you answer. And so a few examples here. What's the overall value of the inventory? What's the cost to maintain value? That's a question that DOTs are expected to answer in their TAMPs. How much should an agency invest in its existing assets to maintain value? How should funds be allocated? This is a question you may or may not be able to answer depending on how you've done the calculations. What's the best life cycle strategy? And also, what value is generated by an asset? So these are all questions that, depending on how you've done the calculations, you can use asset value to help answer. So briefly, some other updates. We've got 4 new videos added into the website related to Chapter 5, so it's very exciting. And then we did update the literature review and added about 15 references, typically things published since the guide was first developed, reflecting recent advances in this area. So that's my quick overview of Chapter 5, and with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Kiana.
All right, thank you, Bill. Our final recorded presentation is from Chris Whipple. Chris is a professional engineer and the state asset manager for Utah DOT. He's worked in his current role for the past 3 years, prior to which he was a design engineer for 15 years, both with UDOT and as a consultant. Chris is passionate about the collaboration and connections between asset management, performance management, and risk management. We also have Patrick Crowley here today to answer questions on the presentation that Chris is going to be giving. Let's view his presentation.
My name is Chris Whipple. I'm the state asset manager for UDOT. The unit reached out to me and just asked me if I could give, an overview of our experience with the asset valuation process. So I apologize that I had to record this in advance, but wanted to make sure that we could communicate some of this. just to step you through kind of our process, I think hopefully everyone's somewhat familiar with UDOT, but give you a background on where we were. About 2 years ago, I met with all of our asset stewards. I meet with them on a regular basis to talk about, a variety of needs, things along those lines. But we were preparing our asset register, what we called our asset register. It's what we use. It's a spreadsheet that captures all of the asset values from each one of these assets that we publish to federal highways. And then we also report it to our state legislature. So really critical that we had that accurate. I had taken over that position maybe 6 months prior and just started asking questions with our asset stewards. I said, so just a question, how is inflation handled with each one of your assets? And I got mixed responses. I get mixed looks. We had, some people looking at others and saying, well, how do you do it? I think we add a 4%. And I think we take it into account in our software, their separate asset management software. And nobody really knew. There wasn't a real documented process. Turns out that they had been keeping track of it. It's just there wasn't really good documentation of it. And it wasn't consistent. And so that was one of the things that we said, we should probably, look at making sure this is consistent and that we have that documented. It was about the same time that I became aware of the asset value guide through one of our TAM webinars like this. So I reached out to SpyPond to see if we could get them to help us because they literally wrote the book. And specifically, we were looking at what we call our tier 1 and tier 2 assets. I won't dive into that too much, but those are our higher dollar, higher risk assets that we typically program out. We look at performance and condition on each one of those. And so that's kind of where we were. Really, people knew that something existed, but that's about as far as they knew. So one of the things that we did is we met with each one of our asset stewards to discuss their assets and how they currently value those assets, the level of valuation that they need, and then what level of data do they have available. So we sat down with each one of them. We dove into what exists and what's documented and what's not. We asked them a lot of really good questions. We focused on what exists, what is needed, what is available, what can we do now, and what can we do in the future. Our goal there was really to create a simple and consistent documented process that anyone can repeat for every asset, which was kind of a tall order, but and we were kind of worried going into it, but we come to find out we actually had quite a bit of data available, and we were able to do some more complex valuations for some of our simpler assets just because we had the data. So in Utah we run in Google, and so we want to keep this as simple as possible. So all of this was built in a Google Sheet. So we didn't want to have any kind of scripting or interface, and that's the one nice thing about one of the many nice things that we follow. As we use the asset valuation guide, you can make it as complex or as simple as you need, and that's really what we were doing as we met with each one of these asset stewards. So one of the things that kind of came out of this, we found that we really needed to establish what was included in those estimates. We didn't know if we were using replacement cost. What was that straight materials? Did it include labor? Did it include things like maintenance of traffic, right away? training, construction engineering, right? Like all these different things. And some people were including those things, some were not. And so that was kind of that next stage. We came up with a consistent list of what was actually included and then also what was not included. So what that allowed us to do was we had like a general introduction page on the spreadsheet that said, these are all the things that are included. These are all the things that are excluded. And then we also defined whether or not there was a depreciation calculation in those assets, which kind of changes the way some of the assumptions in the valuation. So that was one of the ways that we were able to really refine the scope and help us understand what we're looking for. This right here is just an example of a couple of the different assets. You probably can't see this at all. It's pretty small, but I want to give you a screenshot of how simple and straightforward these are. But yet there's some complexity built into it. So on the left there is our pavement data. That's actually fed from pavement condition data and a few other sources that allows us to understand a percent remaining value. So it calculates out its condition, and then we're able to understand how much life we anticipate it has left, which gives us a percentage. We distinguish it obviously by the way we report it to the feds, but we also have some other breakdowns that we used in that process. And so we were able to really hone in on what the current value was and the replacement value. We also added ways for people to provide, there's an external source that they're pulling this from. You have a link for it, and you can see that in the sign asset valuation. Maybe you can't, but we just had a link right in there. So it went directly to, maybe they had another spreadsheet or maybe they had another source. And so that was really what we were shooting for, was to make it as simple and repeatable as possible. On the signs side of things, that it's nothing more than a replacement unit cost and then the number of signs, right? The inventory to give us a replacement value. So that one wouldn't have a current value. We're just looking at replacement value. That's kind of an example. It varied by asset. Like some of them, we had a lot of the data and we were able to capture that. Some of them, we didn't have any data. And so it was, and we made sure we clarified that there's an assumption made there. Kind of one of the things that we did, so where are we headed with this? I'll tell you, we've used asset value in varying levels of in terms of how it benefits TAM or asset management here at UDOT. It's definitely emerging. I wouldn't say we have, a real useful thing other than just reporting our asset value or our net present value. We're really good at that. That's what we do. One of the things that we're moving toward, and this comes straight from the asset valuation guide. One of the things that we're using it for is an asset sustainability ratio. In fact, our STIP cycle this time around, our executive leadership asked for a simple way for us to see, are we spending enough money to really maintain our assets? And we've used different methodologies. We're working on a much more complex approach to things, but this is really, kind of that simple way for them to see you aren't spending enough to maintain it at this condition, to hit this target. And that's one thing that we're moving toward with the asset valuation. That's probably like one of the biggest things that we're looking for. and one of the things that we're trying to help people do. So with that, yeah, I'll turn the time over to, hopefully Patrick can answer some of your questions. If not, please just provide your questions to me. My email, yeah, will be there. And so you guys can get a hold of me. Let me know. I'm happy to show you the spreadsheet that we came up with. I'm happy to step you through any of those assets and any more details if you need those. So thank you.
Thank you to Chris for that. And we appreciate all of our presenters today to taking their time to share their experiences and insights. So now, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat feature or just unmute and ask. You can also raise your hand and we can call on you for multiple ways. I will get us started, and if we could have, I think Matt, Marty and Patrick just put their cameras on. And so Marty, I wanted to ask you your thoughts on, given that the chapter 2, I would say, approaches strategy and planning from that systems planning kind of bigger picture view. And then we saw the presentation from Trisha that's really getting into a bit more of an operational planning with their actions. And I just wanted your thoughts on how does an agency kind of do both effectively, and what's your observation about how where the industry is in that spectrum?
So I guess I'd say that most client organizations have where they systematically try and have that linkage to the line of sight of what is the strategic priority. It's actually kind of two lenses that you can evaluate a given decision. So the best example is a capital project, and you're evaluating between X, Y, and Z, 3 projects. There's contribution to service priority that most operational folks are, by virtue of their role, focused on. I'm obligated to, I will choose between X, Y, and Z based on what I think is the best option for me to achieve my, the average condition across the portfolio, or to address a safety issue, or whatever is the operational parameter that is driving their decisions. You can also evaluate almost as a separate, we often use a 2x2 to say, well, which of these projects not just contribute to service and service metrics or service performance, but align strategically to the organization, to what those strategic priorities are. And that might be a different ranking.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be that as an organization, you have to choose a sort of weighting, that's often done, or just lay it out on the table for the strategic decision makers. Here are the strategic projects, but here are the ones that actually contribute most to service priority. So that's, they're elected, or they're in those leadership positions to make those decisions, and let's just slide enough detail across the table for them to make an informed decision, because it's not necessarily identical, and having both lenses can be helpful. The third lens that is often used as well, I would say, is a risk, so which project allows us to have the least residual risk of service failure or resilience. So, that's kind of a 3-dimensional sort of visualization or manner in which for us to allow decision makers to make an informed choice.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Marty. Patrick, how about UDOT? I mean, I feel like UDOT is also an agency that is very active in the more kind of implementation planning side of how you approach asset management. And But you know that given that you have the documents like the TAMP, which is very big project, big picture and directional in that 10-year target setting view, versus all, you know, I mean, you're very involved in doing assessments of gaps and then what actions you're taking. Like how do you balance that that range of big picture planning to, you know, get the things done, you know, the actions you need to do, and how do you make the connections work?
You know, if I had that answer, I'd be a millionaire. But I can tell you what we've done.
Mhm.
We definitely have big aspirations, right? We hope to be like Minnesota one day. We hope to be better than Minnesota one day. And we recognize that turning the ship is not easy, right? There's cultural, there's indoctrinated thought processes, and people are used to doing things the way they're supposed to do it. And so what we've tried to do is kind of journey together, right? So we have our big idea of where we want to go, but we have to tackle it one little thing at a time. There's only a handful of us in asset management here in UDOT. And so what the guide has done for us is it's really helped us to focus our efforts. Instead of trying to do everything all at once, we're like, you know what, we can do valuation. That's something that we can tackle these next few months. And then we're going to talk about data and data quality and where does that reside? And that's what we're going to work on. And the TAM guide has been really great to help us understand where the biggest gaps are, where we think we can bridge gaps from where we are to where we want to be, and even understand if our big picture is actually where we want to be, right? You get to look at a level 5 or level 4 as you do that assessment and say, do we really need to be everything or all the way out to those highest levels in each one of the areas? And so as we're, you know, working through and bringing people along in the journey, they're starting to understand more and more. Like valuation in the past had a different flavor than it does now. Now that Chris has done all this work and has explained what the purpose is, it's not just a back of the napkin, it's about this much, right? There's much more data intensive looks at why we're asking for the information, what it's used for, how it might help us in the future to make better decisions. And, you know, change management was mentioned earlier in the webinar here. That's a very real thing, is getting people to think differently about how we can do things better. Status quo is one of those that it's a fallacy. If you believe that you're just maintaining, you're actually slipping behind. You always have to be working towards advancing. It's like our assets. They're always degrading, but it's imperceptible until it falls apart. And so if we're not actively maintaining our systems, our processes, and our education and how we can get better, we're going to be falling behind on how to better manage those systems and assets.
Thanks, Patrick. We have a question in the chat. So so for both of you, Marty and Patrick, are there any examples of asset management programs that include traffic signal hardware assets? And for those, what financial analysis methods are agencies using to assess their value? So maybe Patrick, specifically, because I know you are looking at different asset types, you know, you did go through a exercise of doing the asset valuation on signals, right? I thought that was one of Chris's examples in the presentation.
That's exactly right. We did. And unfortunately, I am not an expert in this. I've got the spreadsheet that he mentioned up in front of me. what we tried to do with our tier 1 and tier 2 assets, so those high dollar, high risk assets, of which signals is one of them, we tried to incorporate depreciation through that, whereas our tier 3s, not so much. And so that's kind of a departure of what we've done in the past. To be able to pinpoint the exact calculations that we've run, can't articulate that right now, but we'd be happy to reach out to whomever asked the question and walk through exactly how we've done that. It's not an easy thing because sometimes they become technologically obsolete before they become physically obsolete. And so with our ITS devices, with signals, we've had to kind of factor that in. It's not just a depreciation curve like a hard asset. And so understanding and at least accounting for that, and putting in those timeframes that are different than physical depreciation has helped us to understand the valuation of what is the replacement cycle and obsolescence. Like I mentioned, we went from we went to LEDs, which then creates a problem that snow gets stuck to them because it doesn't melt off anymore. And so we have to now put heat tape on those. And what does that mean when you have to update it and upgrade signals? And so there's little nuances in there that as we do the valuation, we try to take into account what technologically, physically is needed in order to replace, but that depreciation as well. So not a satisfactory answer, but I'd be happy to explore that further at another time.
That sounds good. Marty, have you had experience with, ancillary, assets
Yeah,
like?
well, I guess I would answer a little bit generically, but I think it's applicable in that, especially where there's obsolescence potentially or changing technology, often, and I think Bill covered a little bit of this already in his overview. We evaluate what is the cost of replacement. So if it's a new technology, what you paid for it historically, and if you're not replacing like with like, that's also not relevant. The replacement of what you're going to have to replace it with, whatever that new technology is more valid for forward-looking planning. I'm an accountant as well, and depending on which accountant you ask for, most of them like historical cost and depreciation and amortization relative to that historical cost, which is somewhat useless when it comes to looking forward. And so evaluating what is it you're going to have to replace it with, and how much life do you think the existing asset is remaining before you have to fund that replacement, and then reduce the value based on how old it is and how much life is left. That gives you kind of the value to you because it's still providing service to the function you need it to provide. And if it's obsolete tomorrow or next year, then it has very little service life. As Patrick was saying earlier, it may be that it's in great condition, but it's not suitable for an autonomous vehicle or whatever other technology that is required with a given function. So I think that's the approach we would use, especially when there's some question marks around what is going to be the trigger for replacement.
All right, thank you. Thank you to both. And Diana's provided email addresses for Trisha and Chris. Maybe Patrick, you and Marty should just enter your email addresses to the chat. So if people want to reach out to you, they'll have it. I want to also remind everyone of the survey that Christos mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, and Diane has put the link to the survey, and encourage all of you to take it. I think this is a survey, it's really, they're open to everyone in the transportation community who are involved in asset management. And these surveys really help guide what future webinar topics are, as well as other activities that the Subcommittee on Asset Management undertakes, as well as Federal Highways and TRB. All right, so our next webinar is going to be held on Wednesday, December 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. It's TAM Webinar 72, and it will focus on asset performance, monitoring, and adjustment. So this is going to be chapters 4 and 6 of the TAM guide, and we'll provide more information about that webinar as we get closer to the webinar date. And additional webinars will be continuing, scheduled every 2 months. Please send ideas for the webinars you'd like to see. You can send it to Anna. You can go to the TAM portal and submit it in the kind of, I think there's a interface where you can make a comment. And as a final reminder, you can find additional information about past and today's webinar at tam-portal.com. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to our presenters. Bye.